Um, Making excuses for dictators is nothing new. This is something that the Republicans and the Nazis do. Now the Republicans boy crush on Putin and Orban isn't surprising considering the legendary Republican Senator Robert Taft. Now readers may be familiar with Rachel Maddow's explosive new podcast called Ultra, which I don't watch her show or podcast or anything. Um, but it tells the incredible story of a German spy who infiltrated Congress back in 1940 and 41, and he inducing 2 dozen congressmen and senators to spread Nazi propaganda and floor speeches, the op-ed columns and constituent mailings. Simultaneously, armed extremist groups began training for a violent takeover of the country, and in many ways, the 8 decades-old story is a disturbing forerunner of the Trump era. Um, Contrary to our nostalgic memories of unity, America was deeply divided over the war in Europe, military aid to Britain, and whether fascism was the wave of the future that we might as well submit to now. While political division on the eve of entry into the war was not uniformly partisan, some prominent Democrats supported isolationism. The GOP was by far the party that stood for America first and strict non-involvement in foreign conflict. Not anymore. Um, that members of Congress would willingly become conduits for Nazi propaganda shows that for some sincere concern to stay out of war was not their only motivation. And there was surprisingly strong domestic sympathy for Hitler and the fascist powers. Um, those who actively worked for Germany crossed the line into subversion and treason, but even mainstream proponents of isolationism showed a tolerant understanding for fascism that decades later seems either shockingly naive or disgracefully callous. Um, it is easy to write off Father Coughlin or Charles Lindbergh for their overt anti-Semitism and admiration of totalitarian regimes, but there is only one American person who is to this day is almost universally celebrated by the GOP as a statesman exemplifying pure principled conservatism. The three-time aspirant of the Republican presidential nomination, Senator Robert A. Taft. He was such a pillar of the GOP that he was dubbed Mr. Republican. He was neither Lindbergh's Nazi sympathizer reputation, nor he has neither Lindbergh's Nazi sympathizer reputation, nor the still lingering stench of Joseph McCarthy's witch hunting a decade later. Mainstream historians even while depreciating his politics and calling his opposition to aiding Britain misguided. Nevertheless, people give him points for principle and integrity. Now the conservative think tanks churn the many hagiographies of Taft. The National Review recently proclaimed him as Middle America's sorely needed answer to wokeism, whatever the fuck that may be. Now Taft's Senate career spanned from 1939 to 1953. He came to Washington as America was recovering from a shattering depression, and then had to confront fascist militarism. After World War II, the country faced challenges from two former allies, the Soviet Union and Communist China. Now, with the stakes raised by the existence of nuclear weapons, how the fuck did Taft even respond to this decade of existential crisis? From the moment he stepped foot in office, he campaigned relentlessly against the New Deal, cleaving to Herbert Hoover's futile notion that rugged individualism and private charity would end the worst depression in modern history. Back in 1940, Robert Taft wrote that there is a good deal more danger of the infiltration of totalitarian ideas from the New Deal circle in Washington than there will be ever from any activities of the Nazi Bund. While asserting the need for a strong military, Taft nevertheless fought tooth and nail against preparing that military. He opposed both the Destroyers for Bases deal with Britain and repealing the Neutrality Act. He would also vote against the Selective Service Act at a time when the German army, fresh from a lightning conquest of Western Europe, had 4.5 million soldiers when the U.S. Army only totaled 269,000 people. In early 1941, he opposed the Lend-Lease Act, saying that an invasion of the United States by the German army is as fantastic as it would be an invasion of Germany by the American army. The The German army didn't reach America, but within a year, U-boats were prowling the eastern seaboard, sinking tankers and freighters almost at will. And the rest of Taft's statement was also a bunk. Less than 4 years after his speech, the U.S. Army was advancing towards the Rhine. 8 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Taft stated it is simply fantastic to suppose that there's any danger of an attack in the United States by Japan. But back in September of 1941, he said there is much less danger to this country today than there was 2 years ago, and certainly much less than there was 1 year ago. And at the moment he spoke, the Wehrmacht was driving towards Moscow, and Rommel's Africa corps ruled the North African littoral, and the Admiral Yamamoto was refining his Pearl Harbor attack plan. Many of us would be embarrassed to see our predictions read back to us later on, but few deserve to be embarrassed as much as Taft. The man was a walking compendium of error. Even entry into the war did not cure his penchant for being wrong, and wrong in a way that tended to absolve the enemy while condemning the U.S. government. 4 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he basically said we need not have become involved in the present war. And even a year later, he publicly asserted that U.S. entry into the war was debatable, which it was not. Japan attacked U.S. territory and Hitler declared war on the United States, not the other way around. Taft, like Republicans then and now, attempted to make political hay over wartime inflation. And at the same time, though, he was a relentless opponent of the Office of Price Administration, which was tasked with dampening price raises. And that he said would rob the businessman or the firm of their liberty or setting prices as high as they fucking wanted. Now, Taft questioned Henry Stimson's competence to run the Department of the Army and voted against confirmation, even though Stimson had previously been a Secretary of War under Taft's own father, President William Howard Taft, and was to prove an effective leader in World War II. Now, moreover, Stimson was a Republican nominated by Roosevelt as a gesture of bipartisanship, and Taft opposed him out of knee-jerk obstinacy. In 1944, Taft opposed an administration proposal to enable voting by the millions of GIs overseas. As David Brinkley writes in Washington Goes to War, he offered obstructionist amendments to make the plan impossible to implement, but they were voted down. Now, Brinkley relates that the senator complained that servicemen would be marched out to the polling places in order to vote for FDR, and presaging the current GOP's obsessive psychological projection about voter fraud. At war's end, he criticized the Bretton Woods Conference, from which emerged the financial institutions that laid the foundation for the unprecedented prosperity in Europe and America. Now, almost 80 years later, a majority of congressional Republicans emulate Taft in opposing the international organizations like the International Monetary Fund that would have reinforced America's status as the world's leading financial power. Now, Republicans are now even hinting that they might hold the country hostage over the debt ceiling increase, potentially plunging the world into a financial crisis and triggering a sovereign debt default that could end the dollar's reign as the world reserve currency. Then came Taft's most controversial stand. He attacked the Nuremberg Tribunal for unjustly applying ex post facto law, which was the crime of aggression, and for being the victor's justice. Basically, this is what he had said. I question whether the hanging of those who, however despicable, were the leaders of the German people, will ever discourage the making of aggressive war, for no one makes aggressive war unless he expects to win. About this whole judgment there is the spirit of vengeance, and vengeance is seldom justice. The hanging of the 11 men convicted will be a blot in the American record, which we shall long regret. In the trial, 11 defendants were indeed sentenced to hang, but 7 others were given lesser sentences, and 3 of the people were acquitted. As for the claim of ex post facto justice, Robert Jackson, the American prosecutor who believed aggression enabled all the other war crimes that followed, summed this up. Basically, he said this. This is what Robert Jackson has said. Let me make this clear. While this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law, if it is to serve a useful purpose, must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment. We are able to do away with domestic tyranny and violence and aggression by those in power against the rights of their own people only when we make all men answerable to the law. While the charge of aggression was unprecedented, all precedent must begin somewhere. The convicted defendants were also found guilty of ordering or committing acts against military and civilian victims, which were already prescribed by law. According to Kim Primel's The Betrayal, the Nuremberg Trials, and German Divergence, the judges demonstrated independence from their government, and the defendants, who were allowed counsel and able to present differences, and they were seen as receiving due process, the evidence of their guilt was overwhelming. At that point, Taft's positions were backfiring on him. His condemnation of the Nuremberg trials in opposition to military voting, in particular, might have torpedoed his chances for the Republican nomination back in 1948. But he may have also doomed the nominee Tom Dewey, who was heavily favored to win the presidency. But when President Harry Truman called Congress into extraordinary session in 1948, Taft blocked even innocuous bills, angering voters and inadvertently contributing to Truman's upset re-election. As one might expect, he voted against confirmation of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, saying that it was a waste of money and that was more likely to incite war than to deter it. As for standing on principle, however wrong-headed, a quality that qualified him for grudging admiration even for critics, that trait was sometimes malleable or something like that. In 1950, Taft blamed the UN for not averting the Korean War, saying that we were sucked into the Korean War as representatives of the UN by delusion as to a power which has never existed under that charter. Now, here's what General Douglas MacArthur had said. Yet General Douglas MacArthur's reckless pursuit of the North Koreans to the Yalu River, it brought Chinese intervention in a wider war, and worked a change of heart in Taft. Now he was not only for the war, but when MacArthur insubordinately attacked President Truman's policy and advocated use of nuclear weapons, Taft stated that this on the Senate floor after Truman made the correct decision was to fire the general. President Truman must be impeached and convicted, which never happened. His hasty and vindictive removal of General MacArthur is the culmination of a series of acts which have shown that he is unfit morally and mentally for this office. The American nation has never been in greater danger. It is led by a fool who is surrounded by knaves. That the legendary anti-interventionist Taft supported a vain martinet whose tirades included lobbying for nuclear war suggests that he might have been less than a rock-solid man of principle. The fact that the 1952 presidential campaign was nearing makes us suspect that he may have sought to exploit MacArthur's popularity to get the presidential nomination, but it was not to be. His record was too blemished. Now, why dredge up this ancient history? It tells us not only that some political golden age of republicanism, just like all retrospective utopias, never existed, but that the icons of those myths were flawed, sometimes badly so. It also suggests that the Republican Party, apart from intermittent post-World War II periods of bipartisanship, never really changed. It is true, though, that today's GOP has sunk into unprecedented depths, and they crossed the threshold from a quasi-normal political party to an authoritarian movement and a leader cult. The Klan attack of January 6, 2021, a majority of House Republicans defended the violent insurrectionists against constitutional order. Now, the party's reliance on reflexive negativity rather than constructive alternatives, and its knee-jerk propensity to comfort the comfortable and afflict the afflicted have been features ever since the onset of the Great Depression. Robert A. Taft is not an alternative to the current GOP, but Mr. Republican was simply the larval stage of what exists today. The negativity and obstructionism that we witness daily from the GOP is straight out of their old playbook for contesting the New Deal and crucial areas of World War II policy. The positioning on issues is also much the same. Taft decried Roosevelt and Truman as warmongers, but turned on a dime to extol MacArthur, a general so imperious that he was called the American Caesar. Now, likewise, the current GOP issue positioning largely depends on whether a Democrat or Republican is president. Now, sentimental constructs like the Greatest Generation paint a false picture of unity during World War II. It is often hard to distinguish where the bitter and isolationism of the highly influential press moguls William Randolph Hearst and Robert McCormick ended and sympathy for fascism began. It requires no speculation about Henry Ford, one of the richest and most influential Americans at the time, but he was awarded and happily accepted a medal from Adolf Hitler. There also are grounds for questioning whether, beneath the posturing about liberty and the Constitution, Taft had a sneaking sympathy for fascists, albeit not as overt as Lindbergh, but denouncing the Nuremberg trials as a gross miscarriage of justice fairly begs for explanation, as into the decades following the only critics of the tribunal were outright neo-Nazis like Harry Elmer Barnes or David Irving. This tarnishes his reputation, and it makes one wonder if he deserves inclusion in the Senate Reception Room's famous 5 collection of portraits of great senators, and perhaps the Senate's greatest honor. Now, likewise, Taft did really believe that the New Deal was a bigger threat than Nazism, or was that a hollow rationale to camouflage a belief that Germany might as well rule Europe? We can similarly suspect that when Republican opponents of aid of Ukraine say that they vote no for the absurd reason that helping Ukraine against Russia somehow means appeasing China, an ally of Russia, is sympathy for an authoritarian dictatorship, might be the real motivation behind this. Now, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban was the keynote speaker at the recent CPAC convention, and it only heightens the suspicion. A substantial overlap between Republican opponents of aid to Ukraine and those defending an attempted overthrow of constitutional government, like what happened on the Klan attack on January 6th, is hardly coincidental. Republicans have signaled the possibility of cutting off aid to Ukraine, an act which would have grave implications not only for Europe, but it would also indicate U.S. unreliability throughout the world. If Republicans abandon Ukraine, it would sabotage the deterrent effect of any security guarantees to Taiwan against China, the country the GOP claims to take seriously as a threat. Now, Republicans' willingness to hold hostage America's full faith and credit in 2023 is based on their alleged concern about the deficit, but only when a Democrat holds the presidency. It reflects that goes back to Taft. The goal is to force cuts in Social Security and Medicare, and arguably the country's 2 most successful anti-poverty measures, one of which was proposed by FDR almost 90 years ago. In a sense, the GOP has never ceased running against Roosevelt and the New Deal. Now, as this is being written, our country is without a functioning House of Representatives. Now, 20 legislative terrorists from the GOP are holding their own leader, Kevin McCarthy, a piece of shit, hostage in order to receive plenary powers to run the institution according to their whims. Now, the overlap between these members and the supporters of the January 6th Klan attack and a Ukraine aid cutoff only increases fears that they would abandon Ukraine and destroy the full faith and credit of the United States from no deeper principle than a nihilistic urge to break things. Now, back in 1940, the Wall Street Journal asserted that our job today is not to stop Hitler, the dictator whom the editorial claimed had already determined the broad lines of our national life, at least for another generation. Now, note that the journal then is now the flagship of respectable conservatism, not only consigned Europe to Hitler's domination, but America as well, and for the following 30 years. Now, the title of the editorial, A Plea for Realism, is a reminder that in some quarters, realism means abandoning democracy and submitting to force. Now, as the Second World War passes from living memory, it is apparent that Democrats on both sides of the Atlantic have forgotten its frightful lessons. The right-wing political parties in Europe and America have lurched towards racial populism, xenophobia, anti-intellectualism, and they have even tried to punish anti-Semitism back into the realm of acceptable views. It is hardly coincidental that once again there was a major war in Europe. If someone who had followed the debate over aid to Britain in 1940 were magically transported to the present, he would have little difficulty getting oriented to the global situation, both in its military precariousness and in the threat of advancing dictatorship. And even if we had heard Josh Hawley, a Rand proclaiming America first on the floor of the Senate, he could be forgiven for hearing the voice of Robert Taft. Now, if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you will know when a new video comes out. If you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, or you can also, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And also, if you want to check out my other YouTube channel, I have a review channel, RBW King Reviews, and also you can check that out. for any further if you want to have a laugh on a lot of stuff on the reviews I do. I do a lot of book reviews, I do movie reviews, book reviews, and porn reviews and food reviews. So if you like that, you can check that out. And I'll be back in a couple hours for another video. And thanks for listening.